Since accepting that job, Mason never imagined anything could truly disturb him. He came from the city, used to lonely shifts, empty buildings, and endless early mornings. But what he found in Willow Creek was something entirely different. A closed-off town where weathered faces hid behind curtains whenever a stranger walked down the street, and a cemetery isolated from everything, where silence hung so thick it felt like the air itself clung to the gravestone. The job offer had come through a distant cousin, 1 week of night watch at Wanderer's Rest Cemetery, just outside town. The previous guard, Mr. Allen, had left the position without warning. No explanations, just that it was for personal reasons. The pay was decent, and to be honest, Mason needed the money. The first night passed without incident. They handed him the keys to the guard shack, a flashlight, a folder with the cemetery layout, and an old rusty first aid kit. A young guy from the mayor's office accompanied him, but said little. He dropped Mason off at the entrance and left in a hurry, as if he couldn't wait to get away. Mason checked the perimeter before sundown. It wasn't a large cemetery. The graves were aged, many without names, overgrown with weeds. At the center stood a low stone structure, the communal mausoleum. According to locals, that was where the unidentified were laid to rest, people who had died along the highway and had been forgotten. Back at the shack, with night settled in, he sat down in the old swivel chair and lit a cigarette. On a small metal shelf, he found a thick cardboard notebook, damp with time. He opened it out of curiosity. On the first page, a name faded in ink. Howard Granger, town gravedigger. The handwriting was uneven but legible. What he read made him straighten up and put out the cigarette. Don't trust the silence. Around here, silence doesn't mean peace. It means something is watching. Mason chuckled nervously. He figured it was just some old joke or backwoods superstition, but the following lines spoke of windless nights, birds that never sang, and faint whispers near the mausoleum steps. He closed the notebook. He wasn't there to spook himself with old stories, yet something deep in his chest kept him alert. Like the place itself, resented being watched. In the distance, an owl hooted, and for a brief second, Mason felt a strange kind of relief. If you're the kind of person who loves stories like this, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments about the most unsettling thing you've ever experienced. What Mason lived through that week would mark him forever. And that first night was only the beginning. The second night arrived with a warm breeze from the coast, but the air around the cemetery remained thick and unmoving. Mason showed up a few minutes earlier than usual. Something inside urged him to be there before the darkness took full hold. He had spent most of the day thinking about what he had read in the gravedigger's journal. No matter how hard he tried to forget it, one phrase echoed in his mind like a chant. Silence doesn't mean peace. He opened the notebook again, intending to read more. The next pages were no less disturbing. Howard described situations that, to someone as pragmatic as Mason, bordered on the unbelievable. I heard footsteps among the graves, not animals, slow, heavy, and later, it always starts after the third unmarked burial. Something stirs down there. Mason closed the notebook. He stood up, grabbed the flashlight, and decided to take a walk. He needed to prove to himself that it was all in his head. The dirt path was dry, his steps kicking up dust between the headstones. He approached the communal mausoleum. It looked larger than he remembered. No plaques, just a blank stone slab. The iron door was sealed shut, rusted, a barely visible cross at the top. He stood there a few moments, almost expecting something to move, but nothing did. On the way back, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When he glanced behind, all he saw were elongated shadows stretched by the moonlight. Back inside, he settled into his chair and tried to shift his focus. He picked up his phone, played some low music. Things seemed to return to normal until just after midnight, when the music cut off. The screen froze for a moment. Then, silence. He thought it was a signal issue, but the change he felt wasn't technical, it wasn't physical either. It was something deeper, as if the world around him had been unplugged. Not a single cricket, not a breath of wind. Even the bulb in the shack dimmed slightly. That's when he heard it. 3 hollow thuds. They didn't come from the door, not from the roof either. They sounded far, yet crystal clear, as if coming from beneath the earth. Mason froze. The flashlight was within reach, but he didn't move. He shut his eyes for a second, as if pretending could make it disappear. But the sounds didn't come again. He thought about opening the notebook, checking if Howard had written anything about those knocks. But now, even touching it gave him a sense of dread. So he stayed still, ears straining, body tense, mouth dry. And though he didn't hear anything else that night, he knew with absolute certainty that the noise had been real. And worst of all, there were still 5 nights to go. On the 3rd day, Mason tried to distract himself. He wandered around Willow Creek's main square, sat down at a small diner for some black coffee, and gently asked around about the cemetery. Most people avoided the topic. Others, more guarded, simply called it heavy ground, or muttered that nothing rests easy there. One old man sweeping his porch mumbled something that chilled him. "They don't bury people there. They bury what's left." Mason didn't reply. He returned to his rented room in silence, turning that phrase over in his mind. As the sun set, he prepared for his shift. This time he brought a notepad. He felt compelled to document anything he witnessed. He wouldn't tell anyone, but if something else happened, remembering wouldn't be enough. As night fell, he made a longer round. He wandered the narrow paths between crumbling graves, paused at splintered wooden crosses, and when he reached the mausoleum, he saw something that froze him. Right in front of the stone foundation, the soil looked disturbed. It wasn't the usual sinking from age or animals. It looked pushed from beneath, the earth bulging with hairline cracks. He crouched down, turned on the flashlight and touched the dirt. It was damp, soft, too soft. He stood slowly and wrote in his notepad, "Loose soil in front of mausoleum. Seems recent. No animal tracks, no crickets. Absolute silence." He tried convincing himself it might have rained early that morning, but the rest of the cemetery was bone dry. No signs of moisture anywhere else, and the silence again was total. He returned to the shack, goosebumps rising on his arms. For hours he sat going through old photos of the cemetery on his phone. An aerial image from Google taken years ago showed fewer crosses, fewer graves, and strangely, the mausoleum appeared smaller, as if it had been expanded at some point. Past 2 a.m., Mason dozed off for a few minutes. He dreamed someone was knocking gently on the shack door, a hesitant, persistent tap, followed by a raspy voice whispering, "Not yet." He jolted awake, heart pounding. The clock read 3:12 a.m. The door was ajar. There was no wind that night. The hinges made no noise. And he clearly remembered shutting it tight. He got up, took a deep breath and locked it. Nothing else happened before sunrise. But when he checked his notepad, he found a line written in his handwriting he swore he hadn't added. The ground was never fully sealed. He closed the notebook with trembling hands. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was certainty. Something was happening here, something that defied logic and language. And he was no longer just a witness. He was part of it now. When he arrived for his 4th shift, Mason noticed something off right away. The door to the metal cabinet, where he'd found Howard's notebook, was slightly open. He was sure he'd closed it the night before. Maybe it had loosened with age. But inside, he found something new. A dusty old cassette recorder with a peeling label that read Night Shift 7. Curiosity outweighed fear. Mason plugged the device into the wall and pressed play. The sound was faint, distorted, as if it had been recorded from far away. For several seconds, all he could hear was the crunch of footsteps on gravel, then a deep sigh, and finally, the voice of a man. Hoarse, tired. It cried again tonight, right at the foot of the mausoleum. Thought it was the wind, but no, it wasn't the wind. It was saying something like, "This isn't the place." Mason fast-forwarded the tape. In another segment, the same voice said, "The ground shifted again. I saw it. Don't tell me I imagined it. It was shaking, like something pushing from underneath." He stopped the tape and sat in silence. The air in the shack had grown denser. It could have been a cruel prank, an old recording made to scare the new guy. But everything matched too well with what he'd already experienced. He put the recorder in his backpack. Something told him it wasn't safe to leave it there. That night, the temperature dropped without warning. Though it was spring and the forecast hadn't predicted cold weather, the shack felt like a freezer. Mason pulled an emergency blanket from the first aid kit and leaned back in the chair, but he couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to that voice. This isn't the place. After 3 a.m., he got up for a glass of water. From the window, he saw the cemetery bathed in pale moonlight. The shadows were long, moving slowly. He walked to the door and cracked it open a few inches. The silence outside was complete. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just a faint scent of damp soil, though it hadn't rained. He thought about checking the mausoleum again. Something inside urged him to do it, but a sudden knot in his gut, a primal warning, made him stop. He closed the door gently and sat down, eyes locked on the recorder, as if expecting the voice to speak again. For the first time in his life, Mason felt there were things a man wasn't meant to understand. Some truths too heavy to carry, and yet something deeper, almost instinctive, pulled him forward. He didn't know it yet, but that would be the last night he would feel even remotely safe. The following night, Mason wasn't calm. Even though nothing had happened since he heard the tape, his body remained tense, like his skin sensed a threat his mind couldn't name. He arrived earlier than usual, and, upon entering the shack, checked that everything was as he'd left it. The recorder still in his bag, the notebook on the shelf, and the door locked tight. He sat down, but barely had time to settle before someone knocked on the door. 3 sharp knocks. He jumped up, heart racing. He checked the side window. No one in sight. He hesitated, but just as he decided not to open it, a voice called out, "Mason, it's me." It was Mr. Allen. Mason cautiously opened the door. There he was, the former night guard. He looked older, thinner, his eyes sunken, skin pale. He wore a thick sweater despite the warmth, and his hands trembled even without cold. He didn't ask to come in. He walked in like he'd never stopped belonging. "You can't stay here anymore," he said, sitting across from him. Mason said nothing. Mr. Allen pulled an old photo from his pocket. It showed the cemetery without a fence, with fewer graves, and in the background, the blurry silhouette of a man in a dark suit, facing away. "I took this years ago. Thought he was one of the groundskeepers. But there were no burials that day." Then he went on, "I've seen him. Not once, but many times. He doesn't move like a person. Doesn't speak like one either. He's just there. And every time another unmarked grave is filled, he appears. Doesn't look at anyone, just stands in front of the mausoleum like he's waiting to be let in. Or out. I'm not sure." Mason listened in silence, throat dry. Everything Allen said matched what he'd begun to experience. The footsteps, the knocks, the suffocating silence, the disturbed soil. "Why did you leave?" he finally asked. "Because one night..." "He looked at me," Allen replied without hesitation. "I don't know how to explain it. He doesn't have eyes, just hollows. But still, he sees you. And when he does, you feel something inside you cracking, like whatever makes you human is slowly fading away." Mason didn't know what to say. Allen stood, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Listen to me. Don't go near that mausoleum again. If you hear crying, don't follow it. If you see the earth moving, don't look. And if it ever talks to you, run, even if you don't know where." With that, he left, walked slowly down the road. Mason watched him go without saying a word. That night, nothing happened. But at dawn, he knew it was the calm before the fall. And maybe Alan had just given his final warning. Mason woke up that morning with a knot in his stomach. Though he'd managed a few hours of sleep, it felt like something had slithered through his dreams, something he couldn't quite remember, but that left his back damp and his fists clenched. He dressed without thinking, made coffee, and just as he was heading out to the cemetery, he received a message from the city caretaker. "Have you heard from Mr. Allen? He never made it home." Mason didn't answer. He grabbed his bike and pedaled to the cemetery gate. When he arrived, the air felt different, heavier. The usual silence now pressed on him, as if the ground itself was warning him to turn around, but he didn't. At the shack, everything seemed in order. He checked the cabinet, the notebook, the recorder, all untouched. But as he walked the perimeter, he saw something that stopped him cold. The chain from the main gate lay on the ground. The padlock was intact. No signs of force, but someone or something had opened it from the inside. Mason swallowed hard. He retraced his steps, grabbed the flashlight, and headed for the mausoleum. The ground in front of the stone was disturbed again, but this time there were tracks. Not animal prints, not normal footprints, more like drag marks, as if something had crawled out. He knelt to examine the soil, dug his hand into the loose dirt. It was damp, still warm. A faint stench of fermented earth filled his nose. Suddenly, something made him jump. A shadow darted in the distance between the trees. He stood up quickly but couldn't make it out. Sweat rolled down his forehead. His heart pounded like a drum. He returned to the shack, not running, but not stopping either. He double-locked the door. That night, while reviewing his notes, he thought about leaving, just grabbing his things and walking away. But something held him back. Part anger, part desperation to understand what was happening. It wasn't just fear. It was a growing obsession to uncover what was buried there, what kept pushing from below. At exactly 3 a.m., while writing in the notebook, he heard footsteps, not from the main road, from inside the cemetery, slow, heavy, as if dragging something. He stood, turned off the light, and peered through the crack in the door. He saw nothing, but then he heard it, a soft breathing pressed against the door, as if someone or something was just on the other side, standing still, waiting. And just as he considered opening it, the steps began to fade away. Mason didn't open the door. That morning, he didn't sleep. And as the sun rose, he understood he was no longer dealing with coincidence or bad dreams. He was at the very center of something far beyond his comprehension, something that had chosen him. Mason started his 6th shift, carrying an anxiety he couldn't even mask in the mirror. His face had changed. Sunken eyes, unshaven beard, and a trembling in his hands not even coffee could calm. Each night grew harder. It wasn't just about what he saw or heard anymore, but what he felt in his bones, as if the place itself knew he had nowhere else to go. Upon arriving, he noticed something new. One of the older headstones, just a few feet from the mausoleum, had fallen over. Not from age or weather. It was thick, heavy. Mason didn't approach it. He just filed it away in his mind with all the other things he couldn't explain. He left his backpack in the shack and went out with his flashlight before night fully settled. He knew if he waited too long, fear would keep him from going out. He walked the dirt paths between forgotten graves, and as he reached the mausoleum, he stopped. It was there again, the figure. This time, it wasn't moving in the shadows or hiding at the edge. It stood upright, motionless, right in front of the mausoleum door, wearing a dark suit, dusty and stained, with damp patches at the cuffs. Its arms hung at its sides, still, and it didn't seem to notice Mason. Mason's heart pounded so loud he feared it could be heard. He took a step back, but something stopped him. It wasn't bravery. It was that sick fascination terror creates, the need to see what you shouldn't. He raised the flashlight. The figure turned its head slowly. Mason held his breath. Where eyes should have been, there were only hollow sockets, but he felt it. It was looking at him. And then, from that lifeless mouth, came a voice. Raspy, cracked. "I was wrong." The words hung in the air, fractured like a memory spoken poorly. Mason stepped back again. His legs nearly gave out. He wanted to run, but his body wouldn't move. The creature, because he could no longer call it a man, didn't advance. It simply took one step to the side and, in a blink, was gone. Not vanished into mist, not walked away. It simply wasn't there anymore. Mason collapsed to his knees, unable to speak. The flashlight slipped from his hands. For several minutes, the cemetery was swallowed by a silence deeper than usual. It was as if the very air had stopped moving, as if even time hesitated to move forward. When he finally managed to stand, his hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't open the shack door on the first try. He locked it from the inside and sat on the floor, back against the wall, eyes fixed on the door without blinking. He could still feel that hollow gaze embedded in his body, and that voice. That voice that didn't seem to come from this world, but had carved itself into his memory like a wound that would never heal. Mason didn't return to the cemetery the next night. He showed up at Willow Creek's municipal office in the morning, his face pale, his hands stained with dry soil, and a yellowed paper folder under his arm. He didn't ask to speak with anyone. He just left the envelope on the secretary's desk with a handwritten note, "For whoever dares to replace me." Inside were 5 items. A copy of Howard's notebook, a transcript of the cassette recording, a rough hand-drawn map of the cemetery with markings around the mausoleum, a letter written by Mason, and an old rusted suit button he'd found days earlier at the entrance of the communal tomb. In his letter, he didn't hold back. "I'm not crazy. Everything here happened. I don't know who or what it is, but it's there, beneath that soil. Sometimes it comes out. It doesn't walk. It doesn't scream. It just watches. It waits. It's not after revenge or company. It's looking for its place, and it can't find it. If you insist on keeping this cemetery open, do it at your own risk. But never, under any circumstance, let anyone stay there alone at night." He didn't sign the letter. That same afternoon, he left town without saying goodbye. No one saw him board the bus, but the shack was found empty the next morning. The keys were hanging from a nail by the door, and on the table was a short note written in pencil. "It's no longer my shift." The town hall never released an official statement, but in the following weeks, the cemetery was closed for maintenance. They installed a new fence, a more modern lock, and a sign that read, "Access restricted due to restructuring." Locals noticed but didn't ask questions. Some claimed they saw lights moving inside at night, as if someone walked with lanterns between the graves. Others swore they heard the chains on the gate rattle near 3 in the morning, even though no one was around. But no one investigated. From afar, Mason tried to move on with his life. He changed his number, avoided the topic, and burned most of his personal notes. Yet something lingered inside him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that eyeless face, that rigid posture, that voice that, despite saying only 3 words, echoed endlessly in his mind. I was wrong. He never knew if it referred to the grave, the place, or itself. But one thing became clear. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't seeking revenge. It was trying to fix a mistake, and until it did, it would remain there, waiting. Nearly 2 years passed since Mason's sudden and mysterious departure. In that time, no one else took the night shift at Wanderers Rest Cemetery. During the day, municipal workers handled basic upkeep, trimming grass, clearing paths, nothing more. The communal mausoleum remained untouched, surrounded by a simple fence. The rumors that once swirled around the place slowly faded, as if forgetting had become the town's defense mechanism, but need always finds a way back in. Gabriel, a 26-year-old newcomer from Galveston, recently unemployed and desperate for work, accepted the night guard position without thinking much. The pay was decent for the area, and the only requirement was covering the night shift. No one told him the previous story. No one warned him of anything. On his first night, Gabriel arrived with a backpack, a thermos full of coffee, and the resolve of someone who doesn't believe in ghost stories. The shack had been renovated, fresh paint, a new desk, and a modern LED light installed on the ceiling. It looked harmless. But when he checked the small metal cabinet, he found something that didn't match the rest. An old envelope, its edges burned, with a name written faintly in pencil. Howard. Inside was a single wrinkled page with a shaky sentence. This wasn't the place. Gabriel frowned. He assumed it was a prank, something left behind by a previous worker. He dismissed it, closed the cabinet, settled into the swivel chair, and turned on the radio. At exactly midnight, he stepped out to check the perimeter. The cemetery, bathed in dim moonlight, seemed completely normal. Old graves, a few dry flowers, some sunken tombs. Nothing out of place. He walked to the end of the path and stopped in front of the stone structure. The communal mausoleum looked older than he'd imagined. The fence surrounding it was barely holding together. He watched it for a few seconds. Nothing. No noise. No movement. He returned to the shack. As he closed the door, he thought he heard something in the distance. A faint sound, almost impossible to detect, like someone softly weeping. He froze, hand still on the doorknob, but the sound didn't repeat. He convinced himself it was in his head, or just the wind passing through the trees. He unpacked, sat down, and opened his book. At 2:37 a.m. he heard it again. This time it was clear. A sigh. Not the wind, not an animal. A human sigh. Just behind him, inside the shack. He spun around, heart racing. No one. Everything was in place. But the coffee cup he'd left full on the table was tipped over, the liquid slowly dripping off the edge. Gabriel wasn't superstitious, but he wasn't stupid either. He closed his book, shut off the radio, and stayed awake until dawn, with his back pressed against the wall, and the unmistakable certainty that he was no longer alone. Gabriel didn't return for the second night. His belongings remained in the shack: backpack, portable radio, book left halfway open. Even his bicycle still leaned against the front gate, in the exact spot he'd left it the night before. The maintenance worker noticed it first, the next morning. Worried by Gabriel's absence, he gave the shack a quick check. Everything seemed in order, until he saw the fallen chair and the back door slightly ajar. No signs of a struggle, no footprints, just a faint trail of dry soil from the door to the rear of the building. The town hall didn't file an official report. They claimed Gabriel had left the job voluntarily, but among the workers, the rumor spread quickly. Another guard who vanished without a trace. No one said it out loud, but everyone thought it. The cemetery was no longer just a place for the dead. It had become a trap without walls, a space where time warped and reason crumbled. Days later, a new employee, assigned to trim the shrubs near the mausoleum, discovered something that had been missed during the first inspection. In front of the communal tomb, where the earth had shifted countless times before, a flashlight was buried, still on. Its beam was weak, flickering. Next to it, a patch of dark, wet soil bulged from the ground. There had been no recent rain. No one could explain it. That same week, the city decided to permanently shut down Wanderers Rest Cemetery. They installed a new gate with reinforced welds and placed cameras along the perimeter. Officially, the closure was for structural concerns, but no worker was ever reassigned there, no night guards, no groundskeepers. Willow Creek learned not to speak of it, as if ignoring it might somehow make it disappear. But some neighbors, those living closest to the northern wall, claimed that on moonless nights the silence thickened again. And if you truly listened, you might hear a short, brittle sob, as if someone, from somewhere deep underground, was still searching for comfort. One last, nameless murmur, a mistake left uncorrected. And though the earth looked still, those who knew the story understood. It was only waiting,